On the night of October 12, 2010, 25-year-old Ethan Walker stepped off a flight from London to Chicago O'Hare. He called his mother at 8:20 p.m., telling her he had just landed and was on his way home. Surveillance cameras caught him walking out of the terminal, dragging a suitcase, looking like any other passenger. That was the last confirmed sighting. From that moment, Ethan vanished. His phone went dark. His bank cards were never used again. And the taxi line, where he should have been recorded, had no clear footage of him getting in or out of a cab. Within hours, the trail collapsed. Investigators quickly turned to three names: a taxi driver who admitted picking him up but could not prove where he dropped him off, a former friend, Alex Parker, who had financial disputes with Ethan and whose phone pinged near the airport that night, and a stranger from the same flight who had argued with Ethan over luggage in the cabin. Each looked suspicious in some way. Each was questioned. And while the case was still fresh, the police and the press leaned heavily on Alex. He was portrayed as the jealous friend, the man with a motive. But the evidence never matched the headlines. No witness placed Alex with Ethan that night. No camera showed the two together. And yet the rumor stuck. For years, Alex lived under the shadow of being called a killer. He lost his job, his home, his stability. He disappeared himself, broken under the weight of an accusation that was never proven. Meanwhile, the investigation stalled. Files gathered dust, leads expired. Ethan Walker's case went cold. Until more than a decade later, when a confession pulled the story back into the light. A drifter, arrested for unrelated crimes, admitted to stopping Ethan on a quiet suburban road, pretending his car had broken down. When Ethan approached to help, he was attacked, killed, and buried in a shallow grave. It was not the taxi driver, not the old friend, not the stranger on the plane. The real killer was someone the police never considered. A serial predator hiding in plain sight. Ethan's last steps at the airport raised more questions than answers. But before we dig into the investigation, we need to understand who he was. Ethan Walker was 25 years old. He was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, the city where he disappeared. He grew up in a middle-class family. His mother worked as an elementary school teacher. His older brother David was a structural engineer. Ethan was the youngest, the one everyone in the family called steady and reliable. He studied computer science, and after finishing his undergraduate degree, he went on to graduate school in London. He had just completed his first year. In May, he boarded a flight back to the United States to spend time with his family. It was supposed to be a simple visit home. Friends described him as smart and easygoing. He avoided conflict. He was the type of person who stayed calm in stressful situations. If someone needed help, he was usually the first to step forward. He loved to travel. He carried a notebook and a camera almost everywhere he went, keeping records of places he had visited. There was nothing in his background that suggested risk or danger. He had no criminal history. He wasn't involved in anything suspicious. On the day of his disappearance, Ethan landed at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. It was the evening of May 14th. He had told his mother his full travel plan before boarding his flight. She knew the exact arrival time. She knew when to expect his call. Ethan was organized that way. When the plane touched down, he gathered his belongings, a suitcase, a backpack, his passport, phone, and wallet. He cleared customs, walked through the terminal, and finally stepped outside into the crowded taxi line. He had not arranged to meet anyone that night. His plan was simple: get into a cab, and head straight home. At 8:20 p.m., Ethan called his mother. It was a short conversation. He said, "I'm getting a taxi home." His tone was normal. He didn't sound nervous. He didn't mention anything unusual. That phone call would become the last moment anyone in his family heard his voice. 15 minutes later, his phone stopped transmitting. The last signal came from a cell tower near the highway leading out of the story of Ethan Walker spread quickly, not only because of the disappearance itself, but because of how ordinary his circumstances were. He wasn't lost in some faraway place. He wasn't involved in anything secret. He walked out of one of the busiest airports in the country and then vanished. His family never gave up searching. His mother kept his photo displayed at home. She told reporters she believed her son was still out there, waiting to be found. His brother became one of the loudest voices pressing police to continue investigating. But in the days immediately after the disappearance, mistakes piled up and precious time slipped away. Ethan became, for many, a symbol of how fragile safety could be. A young man on the brink of finishing his studies, with a bright future, taken in the space of an hour. For his family, the shock was total. For the city, the questions began almost immediately. What happened in the short gap between the phone call to his mother and the moment his phone went dead? Who did he meet in that time? And why was there no camera footage beyond the airport exit? Those questions remain the key to the mystery. Ethan's case did not begin with a complex web of enemies or a trail of suspicious contacts. It began with a straightforward trip home. A flight, a call to his mother, and a taxi ride. Then nothing. That was all investigators had to work with. His story highlights how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into something far darker, and how the traits that make a person kind and approachable can also leave them exposed. Ethan Walker was not reckless. He was not searching for trouble. Yet his willingness to trust may have been what placed him in the path of someone who meant him harm. This was the backdrop against which police launched their investigation. A clean-cut victim, a simple route home, no clear reason for vanishing. With so little to go on, they turned their attention to the people who last appeared in Ethan's orbit. That is when the case shifted, from a missing person to a full criminal investigation, from a quiet family tragedy to a story that would play out in headlines across the city. That decision cost nearly 24 hours. By the time they opened an official case, the crucial window to trace his movements had already closed. Those first hours, when witnesses remember details, when cameras still hold data, when a suspect has not yet hidden evidence, were lost forever. The family pushed. They begged officers to act quickly, but the answer was always the same: wait and see. When investigators finally began, they started at O'Hare Airport. Cameras inside showed Ethan walking out of baggage claim, pulling his suitcase, wearing a light hoodie and jeans. He walked toward the taxi area. That was the last clear sighting. Beyond the main taxi stand, coverage faded. A few cameras were pointed away, others were broken, and no one secured the footage from nearby parking lots. Days later, when detectives tried to pull it, most had already been recorded over. They did not check GPS data from the taxi Ethan might have taken. They did not verify which cabs left the airport at that exact time. They did not even collect the license plates of cars circling the area. Instead, they moved quickly to assumptions. One theory: a conflict with someone he knew. Another, he had walked away by choice. A few witnesses said they saw a man who looked like Ethan outside the terminal, but their statements were vague. None of them were carefully compared or cross-checked. The result was a patchy timeline. Inside the airport, clear. Outside, silence. Mistakes began to pile up. An Amber Alert was never issued. No public bulletin asked drivers to come forward. No canvassing was done along the highway where his phone signal vanished just 15 minutes after landing. That phone ping, recorded by a cell tower near the interstate, should have been a flashing red light. Yet officers didn't send patrols to search the exits, rest stops, or side roads in that zone. If they had, they might have seen the abandoned vehicle the killer used. They might have found something before it disappeared. Instead, resources were concentrated on interviews that went nowhere. They wrote down the taxi driver's version, but never confirmed it with surveillance. They noted Ethan's last call to his mother, but documented the time incorrectly. The family grew desperate. They organized their own searches. Friends printed flyers. They hired a private investigator who found inconsistencies in the official report. But without access to key evidence, even those efforts stalled. Public trust crumbled. Newspapers began to describe the case as another example of police failure. Commentators asked why a young man could walk out of one of America's busiest airports and vanish without an urgent, coordinated response. The truth was simple. The case was already cold before it even started. After only a few weeks, investigators admitted they had no physical evidence. No belongings of Ethan were ever recovered. Not a bag, not a receipt, not a trace of his travel after the airport. Witness statements conflicted with each other, and none were tested against hard data. In the absence of real leads, detectives narrowed the focus to people connected to Ethan. It was easier to investigate those close than to admit the trail outside the airport was lost. By then, the damage was done. Vital hours and days had been wasted. The killer had time to move, to bury evidence, to ensure nothing pointed back to him. The police insisted they were doing everything possible. But to the family and to many in the public, it looked like hesitation, neglect, and missteps. Every delay strengthened the impression that Ethan's disappearance was slipping into the shadows. Eventually, the case entered a frustrating stage. Paperwork, reviews, endless discussions, but no progress. Investigators repeated the same interviews. They recycled the same speculation. The only result was mounting frustration. The tragedy was not only Ethan's disappearance. It was also the realization that those responsible for finding him had let the trail go cold with their own mistakes. By the time weeks turned into months, the investigation was cornered. No body, no belongings, no reliable timeline, just silence. And in that silence, suspicion shifted. With no new evidence, officers turned their full attention to 3 individuals connected to Ethan, people who in their eyes could not be ruled out. This choice would shape the entire Reed wasn't a perfect witness to his own innocence. He had a record. Years earlier, he'd been fined for cheating passengers on fares. Nothing violent, but enough to give the appearance of dishonesty. That alone pushed him to the top of the suspect list. Reporters seized on it. Headlines painted him as the shady driver. His photo was splashed across newspapers. Strangers pointed fingers. Overnight, Reed went from ordinary cabbie to the face of suspicion. He begged anyone who would listen. He said he did nothing wrong. He was just doing his job. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no belongings of Ethan in his car. But the lack of evidence didn't protect him. The narrative had already taken shape. The true failure was simple. Police never considered that Ethan might not have stayed in that cab at all. Maybe he switched vehicles. Maybe someone lured him away. By ignoring that, they locked Reed into a role he didn't deserve. He became the perfect suspect. Not because of facts, but because of an old fine and a convenient gap in the timeline. Then came Alex Parker. Alex was 26, once one of Ethan's closest friends. They'd grown up together, shared classrooms and sports fields. But adulthood brought distance. The break came over money. Ethan had lent Alex cash. The debt lingered. The friendship cracked. When Ethan vanished, Alex was dragged into the case within days. Cell Tower Records placed his phone near the airport that same night. Alex insisted he was at home. He said he hadn't seen Ethan at all. But to police, the phone data told another story. The press took that detail and ran with it. They painted Alex as the jealous friend, the one who owed money, the one who might lash out. Every newspaper, every talk show carried his name alongside Ethan's. And quickly Alex was no longer seen as a young man with his own life. He was the friend who killed. Inside Ethan's family, the pressure grew unbearable. Some relatives wondered aloud if Alex had done it. Others defended him. The division cut deep. And while the family fought among themselves, the police used Alex's. The third suspect was Jack Morales. Jack was 33, a small-time businessman in imports. His only connection to Ethan came thousands of feet in the air. Passengers remembered them arguing on the flight from London. It was over carry-on space, a stupid clash about bags and seats. They traded words. Voices rose, and that was enough for police to add his name to the list. The idea was simple: anger on the plane, violence on the ground. Jack was called in again and again for questioning. He swore it was nothing, just travel frustration, nothing carried beyond the aircraft. There was no evidence otherwise, no camera showing them together after landing, no proof they even left baggage claim within minutes of each other. Their lives had no overlap before that flight. Their paths never crossed in Chicago. Still, newspapers called it the last conflict before Ethan disappeared. The story played well. Readers loved a villain, even if it was thin. For weeks, Jack's reputation was dragged through the dirt. Clients pulled business. His name was tied to a mystery he barely understood. Eventually, the police admitted there was nothing. Jack was cleared. But cleared on paper is not the same as cleared in the public eye. His name would always come up with Ethan's, a reminder of suspicion he never deserved. Together, these three men, Reed, Alex, Morales, were the foundation of the early investigation. Each had a story, each had a weakness, and each was easy to frame. The taxi driver with a shady past, the friend with unpaid debts, the stranger with a loud argument. They became the focus because police failed elsewhere. They didn't chase other leads. They didn't follow the phone ping to the highway. They didn't preserve the wider camera network. When real evidence slipped through their fingers, they turned to the people easiest to blame. Public opinion followed. Forums, papers, television, all split into sides. Some swore the driver was guilty. Others insisted it had to be the bitter friend. A smaller crowd pointed to the angry stranger. Few remembered Ethan himself. Few asked what else could have happened outside those three circles. The coverage was relentless. Reporters parked outside home. That failure would haunt this case forever. And it all started with these three faces, these three names, standing at the center of suspicion. Ethan Walker never came home that night. His family reported him missing almost immediately, but when the call reached the Chicago Police Department, it was classified as a missing adult case. Ethan was 25. He was not a child. The response was slow, almost routine. Officers told his mother to wait. Maybe Ethan was staying with a friend. Maybe he needed space. That single decision cost precious time. Nearly 24 hours passed before an official case was opened. By then, the critical window for finding a missing person was already gone. Those first hours, when witnesses remember clearly, when surveillance still holds data, when a suspect has not yet hidden evidence, were lost forever. The family pushed for urgency. They begged investigators to act, but the reply was always the same: wait and see. When police finally began, they looked only at O'Hare Airport. Cameras inside showed Ethan leaving baggage claim, pulling his suitcase, wearing a light hoodie and jeans. He headed toward the taxi stand. That was the last clear sighting. Beyond that point, coverage dropped. Some cameras were pointed away, others were broken. The rest were overwritten before anyone secured them. Parking lot footage disappeared in a matter of days. Gas station systems auto-deleted their recordings. No one ordered those files protected. The missed opportunities piled up. An Amber Alert was never issued. No bulletin was broadcast asking the public to watch for Ethan. No roadblocks or patrols were set up along the highway where his phone signal cut out. That ping, recorded near the interstate just 15 minutes after he called his mother, should have triggered an immediate search. Instead, officers let it pass. No search of exits, no review of rest stops, no canvass of side roads. The investigation moved in the wrong direction. Detectives focused almost instantly on personal conflict. They framed the case as a dispute with someone Ethan knew, rather than a possible abduction or random crime. Witness statements were vague and contradictory. When errors accumulated, the case began to drift. The official report even misstated the time of Ethan's final call to his mother, introducing confusion into the timeline. Every inconsistency pushed the investigation further off course. By the end of the first week, momentum was already lost. The trail outside the airport was cold. Surveillance data was gone. Witness memories faded. And yet the family kept searching. They printed flyers, organized volunteers, even hired a private investigator. That investigator found discrepancies in the police paperwork, but without access to evidence, he could not move the case forward. Public trust began to collapse. Newspapers highlighted the failures. Commentators asked why a young man could vanish from one of the busiest airports in the country without a coordinated, urgent response. The truth was harsh. The investigation was failing because of hesitation, neglect, and missteps. With no body, no belongings, and no reliable timeline, the case was already cornered. Police had no physical evidence to work with. They had only speculation. And in that vacuum, attention shifted to individuals linked to Ethan. It was easier to look at people close to him than to admit the trail outside the airport was gone. The first name pushed into the spotlight was Daniel Reed, the taxi driver who admitted he picked up Ethan. His account was simple. He drove Ethan from the airport and dropped him near downtown. But there was no camera proof, no GPS data, no receipt. His history of minor offenses made him an easy target. Within days, headlines framed him as the suspicious driver. His life unraveled. even though nothing tied him directly to Ethan's disappearance. The second focus was Alex Parker, Ethan's former friend. The two had once been close but fell out over money. Cell tower records placed Alex's phone near the airport that night. Alex insisted he was at home, but the contradiction was enough. Police leaned on him. The press ran with it. Stories about debt, conflict, and betrayal filled the papers. Before long, Alex was painted as the villain. For the public, it seemed clear. But here is the reality. None of them had hard evidence against them. No fingerprints, no DNA, no camera footage, no recovered belongings. The case against each of them was built on circumstance, rumor, and assumption. The police, however, were under pressure. They needed direction. The public needed answers. The media needed headlines. And so the three men became the story. Alex's life collapsed the fastest. He was unemployed soon after the coverage broke. Neighbors whispered behind his back. Old friends avoided him. Family members questioned him. On television, his name appeared beside the words "prime suspect" again and again. To many, guilt was assumed. Alex carried that stigma every day, even as he maintained his innocence. Daniel Reed faced his own spiral. His income dried up. Passengers avoided his cab. His reputation as a driver was destroyed. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, but his protests were drowned out by speculation. Jack Morales returned to his work, but the label followed him. The man on the plane. For months it shadowed his business and his life. Even when police eased off, the association lingered. Meanwhile, the investigation itself stalled. Weeks passed with no new evidence. No belongings of Ethan were ever found. His phone never reconnected. No card activity appeared. The silence deepened. The family continued to fight. They criticized the police for narrowing the scope too quickly. They begged for a broader search. They pleaded for the case to stay open. But their voices could not reverse the damage, because by then the case had hardened into a narrative. 3 suspects, 1 missing man, and no proof. It was a dead end created by early mistakes that erased the real trail and locked the investigation onto the wrong people. The tragedy of Ethan Walker was not only that he vanished. It was also that the very people responsible for finding him lost the chance through hesitation and poor choices. The public saw it, the family lived it, and the suspects carried it. Within weeks, Ethan's disappearance was no longer a search for a missing man. It was a story about blame. And once blame took hold, it never let go. In the absence of truth, the narrative hardened. Headlines filled the gap left by evidence. Dismissive phrases like domestic dispute and personal conflict became shorthand for the case. They distracted from the fact that Ethan's trail outside the airport had never been followed properly. By the end of the first month, frustration turned into resignation. Detectives recycled the same interviews. The same speculation appeared in reports. No new searches were launched. No new leads were tested. The investigation was not only cold, it was closed, in practice, if not on paper. The final result was devastating. Ethan's family was left without answers. The suspects were left with reputations destroyed. And the public was left with a bitter truth. The case had collapsed, not because it was impossible, but because the system had failed. And in that failure, a new chapter began. Because with no evidence to guide them, and with pressure building from every side. Police turned all their attention to the three individuals closest to the case. They became the official narrative. They became the scapegoats. But none of them were the true killer. That truth would not come for many years. And when it did, it would expose not only a murderer, but also the cost of every mistake made in those first crucial days. Ethan Walker's case had already lost momentum when the media stepped in. And once they did, the story no longer belonged to Ethan or his family. It belonged to the headlines. Newspapers and television shows needed a villain. They found one in Alex Parker, Ethan's former friend. The two had fallen out over money. It was an easy angle, a ready-made motive. Articles painted him as the bitter friend, the one with a grudge. His picture began appearing on screens and front pages more often than Ethan's. The missing man slipped into the background. The suspect took center stage. Headlines screamed, "Did the old friend do it?" Talk shows ran segments about betrayal and money. Every detail of Alex's life was dissected, from unpaid debts to teenage fights. The more the press dug, the darker the picture became, even if none of it connected to Ethan's disappearance. The public followed. On social media, Alex's name trended for weeks. People debated whether he should be arrested, whether the police were too slow, whether a trial was just around the corner. Few questioned whether there was evidence. Few asked why the investigation had stalled everywhere else. Inside Ethan's own family, the pressure caused cracks. Some relatives whispered that Alex had all. The pressure broke him. Alex left town, drifting between shelters and short-term jobs. He was seen less and less. In time, he vanished too, not as a victim of crime, but as a casualty of suspicion. For many, he would always be remembered not as a friend of Ethan Walker, but as the man who killed him. Meanwhile, the case itself was collapsing. Weeks turned into months. No new witnesses came forward, no belongings were recovered, no new leads were tested. The crucial highway ping from Ethan's phone was never pursued. The unlicensed vehicles at the airport were never tracked. Surveillance that might have held answers was long gone. After a year, police quietly reclassified the investigation. It was no longer active. It became another cold case in the files of the Chicago Police Department. The Walker family fought against that decision. They filed complaints, demanding accountability for the missed opportunities. They begged for a federal review. But their voices were met with the same response as the night Ethan first disappeared. Wait. In their home, Ethan's photograph stayed on the wall. A reminder, a warning, a promise that his absence would not be ignored. But outside that home, the world moved on. The media turned to new stories, other crimes, other tragedies. Ethan's case slipped out of headlines as quickly as it had appeared. For the public, it was just another mystery, one more unsolved disappearance in a country full of them. Daniel Reed, the taxi driver, slowly faded from suspicion. Jack Morales, the passenger from the flight, disappeared from the news as well. But Alex's name never recovered. His downfall was permanent, his reputation ruined beyond repair. The truth was brutal. A young man had vanished. His family was left without answers. And the person most heavily blamed was not the killer at all, but a man dragged under by rumor, pressure, and the silence of those who should have known better. The investigation froze. The narrative solidified. For police, it was easier to keep the spotlight on suspects already chosen than to admit the real trail had been lost. For the press, it was easier to replay the same names than to admit the story had gone cold. The case had stalled, the headlines had faded, and Ethan Walker's name slipped into silence. But that silence would not last, because more than a decade later, a new investigation uncovered something far darker than anyone imagined. And when the truth surfaced, it showed that the real killer was never even on the list. Stay with us as we move into the next part, where the forgotten trail finally reopens. More than 10 years had passed since Ethan Walker vanished from O'Hare Airport. For his family, the silence was endless. For the public, his name had long faded. But in a quiet office in Washington, the FBI was reviewing dozens of unsolved disappearances. And one pattern refused to be ignored. Young men, all in their 20s or early 30s, all traveling alone, all vanishing within hours of landing at Chicago's airport. The files were scattered. Different years, different airlines, different local jurisdictions. But when placed side by side, the similarities were undeniable. The timeline was striking. Most of the men disappeared between 7 and 10 at night. Some had just called their families to say they were on their way home. Their phones went silent shortly after, usually near the same stretch of interstate leading out of the city. None of them made it to their final destination. At first, police had treated each case as isolated. Maybe a robbery, maybe a runaway, maybe a private dispute. But with the FBI's larger database, the overlap was impossible to ignore. Chicago was not just a busy airport. It was a hunting ground. Rumors spread quickly once the press caught wind. Articles spoke of a predator around O'Hare. Travelers began to whisper about the risk of landing after dark. Ride services warned passengers to stick to official pickups. The fear was real, and it was growing. Ethan's name reappeared in headlines. His case was added to the list. For his family, it was a painful mix of hope and dread. Hope that answers might finally come. Dread that the answers would confirm the worst. By the time federal investigators stepped in, the trail was old. Evidence was thin. But the pattern gave them a starting point. They began re-examining roadside stock. Suitcases lined the back wall. Some were battered, others looked nearly new. Inside were clothes, wallets, and passports belonging to men who had disappeared years apart. A driver's license still carried the smiling face of a victim whose family never stopped asking questions. Among the items was a worn jacket. Inside the pocket, investigators found Ethan Walker's student ID from London. It was the first concrete link in more than a decade. Confronted with the evidence, Holloway spoke in bursts. He admitted luring men by pretending to be a driver. Sometimes he posed as a taxi. Sometimes he offered a ride from the terminal. His method was simple, almost ordinary. Find someone alone, look trustworthy, and offer convenience. Once inside his car, the trap was set. He described stopping on dark stretches of road, pulling to the shoulder and claiming the engine had stalled. He would ask the passenger to help, to step out, to check under the hood. It played on instinct. Most of the men agreed without hesitation. They wanted to get home. They wanted to be helpful. And when they stepped closer, Holloway struck. The attacks were sudden, brutal, and final. Victims never had a chance to resist. He would then drive to abandoned fields outside the city, where shallow graves waited. Investigators followed his directions to one such site. The ground was uneven, half hidden by weeds and broken branches. Forensic teams began to dig. One skeleton appeared, then another. Soon, nearly a dozen sets of remains were uncovered. Years of unanswered questions were unearthed in a single day. Among them was Ethan Walker. DNA confirmed his identity within weeks. After 12 years of searching, his family finally had an answer. But closure came at a terrible price. Holloway explained his motive in chilling terms. He spoke of power, of control. He admitted he targeted young men who looked helpful, polite, and trusting. He wanted to take from them what he never had himself. Investigators later learned that his childhood was marked by violence and neglect. He had been dismissed, ignored, treated as invisible. That resentment hardened into obsession. By killing, he forced strangers to notice him, to plead with him, to give him the attention he craved in his twisted way. For law enforcement, the revelations were devastating. Everything the original investigators had ignored, Ethan's last phone ping near the interstate, the possibility of an unlicensed driver, the chance that he had entered a car outside the official taxi line, all of it pointed toward Holloway's method. But those leads were never pursued. Instead, attention had been wasted on Ethan's friend Alex, on a cab driver with a checkered past, and on a passenger from the plane. Innocent men had lived under suspicion, while the real killer hunted freely. The discovery shattered every previous theory. Ethan was not a runaway. He was not a victim of personal conflict. He was one of many young men caught in the path of a serial predator who had been operating in plain sight for years. The trial that followed was swift. With physical evidence, eyewitness patterns, and Holloway's own confession, conviction was certain. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, with no possibility of parole. For the families, the courtroom offered truth but not relief. Some relatives wept as they described years of false hope, birthdays without answers, and the torment of never knowing. Ethan's mother spoke of the call she replayed in her mind, the words, "I'm getting a taxi home," words that marked the last normal moment of her son's life. For Alex Parker, the damage could not be undone. He had lived under the weight of suspicion for years, his life unraveled, and before the truth emerged, he had disappeared himself, another casualty of the case. His absence hung over the courtroom like a second ghost. Public reaction was fierce. Commentators called it
The truth, when it finally surfaced, was both a resolution and a condemnation. Resolution for the families who could finally lay their loved ones to rest. Condemnation for the system that failed them at every turn. The case of Ethan Walker was no longer just about one young man. It was about a predator who turned an airport into his hunting ground. It was about years of silence that allowed him to keep killing. And it was about the cost of errors that can never be erased. Even today, travelers in Chicago remember the story. Parents warn their children. Officials insist reforms have been made. But the shadow of those lost men, buried in shallow graves outside the city, lingers as a reminder. Ethan Walker went home that night only in his family's imagination. In reality, his journey ended on a dark road, beside a car that was never broken. And for more than 10 years, the world believed the wrong story. Mark Holloway's story begins long before Ethan Walker vanished. He was born into a house that was broken from the start. His father drank heavily and used his fists more than his words. His mother left for days at a time, sometimes weeks. When she was there, she stayed silent, avoiding both husband and son. For Mark, childhood meant violence on one side and indifference on the other. Neighbors remembered him as the quiet boy sitting in the backyard, staring at nothing.
They rarely saw him with friends. Teachers noted the same, withdrawn, distant, never raising his hand. The pattern was clear even then. He was a child ignored, overlooked, and dismissed. That feeling, being invisible, never left him. It grew with him, shaping the man he would become. As the years passed, that emptiness turned into anger. Mark carried a deep hatred for people who seemed loved, wanted, or admired. He could not stand the sight of young men who walked with confidence, men who looked like the world cared about them. To him, they were reminders of everything he never had. Every smile, every easy conversation he overheard, fueled his resentment. When he reached adulthood, the cycle only worsened. Mark could not hold a steady job. He worked briefly as Mark began to hunt for a very specific type of victim. He chose young men, usually in their 20s. They looked strong, capable, the kind of men others trusted. But more importantly, they looked kind. The ones who would stop to help if asked. The ones who would lean down to check an engine, or offer a ride, or carry a bag. Ethan Walker fit that profile perfectly. For Mark, the pattern was not random. It was deliberate. Taking down those who seemed reliable, friendly, and good was his way of flipping the balance. In his twisted view, destroying the good ones gave him proof of control. His method was as cruel as it was calculated. He often posed as a taxi driver or flagged down travelers near the airport. Other times he staged a car breakdown on a deserted road. He would stand by the open hood, wave, and call for help. And when the young man stepped closer, trusting, ready to assist, Mark struck. He attacked with speed and force, making sure his victim had no chance to resist. In interviews later, he admitted those first few seconds gave him the highest rush. It was the moment the roles reversed. He was no longer the helpless child ignored by parents. He was the one in control. The victim's fear, their pleas, their sudden awareness of danger, those were the things that made him feel alive. Mark confessed he only felt noticed when someone was terrified of him. "They see me then," he told investigators. "They finally see me." The killings followed a routine. After overpowering his victim, he took them to isolated areas outside the city. There he ended their lives and buried the bodies in shallow ground. He kept their belongings, passports, wallets, suitcases. To most killers, trophies are reminders. To Mark, they were proof. Proof that he had taken control from someone who once looked strong and untouchable. Over the years, he collected many such items. Police found them later in an abandoned storage space. Stacks of IDs, folded clothes, even luggage with tags still attached. Forensic testing tied several of them to men reported missing. Ethan Walker, in that sense, was not targeted for who he was. He was targeted for what he symbolized. A young man returning home, calling his mother, preparing to rejoin his family. Exactly the kind of life Holloway could never have. Ethan's kindness, his readiness to help when he saw a car pulled over, sealed his fate. For the FBI, Holloway's confession explained years of disappearances. He admitted to nearly a dozen killings. The shallow graves they dug up outside Chicago confirmed his claims. Each grave held another story like Ethan's. Young men who had trusted the wrong stranger. Young men who stopped when asked for help. The case of Ethan Walker became one piece of a much larger puzzle. It was no longer just about one student vanishing after a flight. It was about a predator who operated in plain sight, near one of the busiest airports in America, for more than a decade. But behind the gruesome details was also a brutal truth about the system. Holloway should have been caught earlier. Signs were there: missing men, similar patterns, evidence overlooked. Yet mistakes, delays, and narrow investigations gave him freedom to keep killing. By the time they finally put him in cuffs, Ethan was gone. So were many others. Mark Holloway stood as living proof of how neglect can breed monsters. Neglect at home, neglect in investigation. And in both, the cost was measured in lives. Ethan's death was no longer just about his disappearance. It became a case study in how failure allows evil to spread. Holloway's past shaped his crimes, but the system's errors gave him opportunity. The file on Mark Holloway is now marked with words investigators rarely use: preventable tragedy. His crimes were horrific, but the years he was allowed to continue only deepened the damage. Ethan Walker's story ended in one of those shallow graves. But his case also forced the world to confront the hidden danger of men like Holloway. Not only killers born of trauma, but killers overlooked by flawed investigations. And that leads us to the final part of this story: the aftermath. The jury did not need long. Less than 1 day of deliberation. They returned with the verdict: guilty on all counts. Holloway was sentenced to multiple life terms with no chance of parole. For the first time in over 10 years, families of the victims knew the killing had ended. The hunt was over. But for Ethan Walker's family, the relief came with deep pain. They had waited 12 years. 12 years of hanging his photo by the front door. 12 years of calling police, writing letters, begging for updates. His mother, Margaret, spoke softly outside the courthouse. "At least my son was found. At least we know." It was a sentence full of exhaustion, not victory. Ethan's brother David was less restrained. He attacked the Chicago Police Department in front of cameras, accusing them of destroying the case in its earliest days. "They failed my brother," he said. "He might still be alive if they had done their job." Weeks later, the family held a memorial service at a small church near their home. Hundreds came to pay respects. The photo of Ethan, once a missing poster, was placed at the altar. Friends spoke of his kindness. Community members lit candles. Afterward, the family donated that photo to a local memorial for missing persons, a reminder of the years lost. The truth had been found, but it came too late. Ethan was no longer missing, but he would never come home. The tragedy extended far beyond Ethan. Alex Parker, once Ethan's closest friend, had been destroyed by the investigation. From the start, Alex had insisted he was innocent. But cell tower records and old disputes with Ethan turned him into a prime suspect. Newspapers branded him the jealous friend. Television shows aired his face with the words "prime suspect" under his name. Alex never escaped the label. He lost jobs. Neighbors avoided him. Even family members doubted him. He slipped into depression, left his hometown, and drifted across shelters. Years later, Alex died alone, homeless, and still carrying the stigma of being the friend who killed Ethan. When Holloway was arrested, journalists revisited Alex's story. Public anger grew. Community groups demanded reform. Activists called for a new law requiring immediate action in adult missing person cases if there were signs of danger. Commentators pointed out that the failure to act quickly had allowed Holloway to kill again and again, while police insisted the case was under control. Under pressure, Harris resigned. His career ended in disgrace. Training academies later used the Walker case as a warning. What happens when investigators let bias and shortcuts replace thorough work? But the blame did not rest only with police. The media faced its own reckoning. For years, news outlets had run headlines that accused Alex Parker without proof. Friend linked to missing Ethan Walker. Debt leads to deadly disappearance. Those stories shaped public opinion and ruined a man's life. After Holloway's arrest, several newspapers published apologies. They admitted their coverage had gone too far. Media critics debated the issue on television. Was it better to report fast or report right? Journalism schools added the Walker case to their curriculum as a cautionary tale of how rumor can masquerade as truth when amplified by national outlets. The public learned a harsh lesson. Police mistakes may have failed Ethan, but reckless headlines destroyed Alex. The tragedy was multiplied. One victim of violence, another victim of suspicion. The impact of the case stretched even further. Lawmakers in Illinois introduced new legislation requiring immediate activation of emergency protocols when an adult was reported missing under suspicious circumstances. No more waiting days. No more dismissing adults as choosing to disappear. Advocacy groups formed, inspired by the Walker family's persistence. Campaigns were launched to educate the public about the importance of the first 24 hours. Other families of long-missing victims found answers when Holloway confessed to more murders, guiding police to burial sites. Ethan's night became symbolic, a reminder of both a life cut short and a system that had failed. Documentaries retold his story. Seminars for investigators dissected the timeline. His case was taught as both a tragedy and a roadmap for reform. The legacy of the airport vanishing in Chicago was not just about a killer. It was about how institutions can compound tragedy when they act too slowly or too carelessly. When the trial closed, the families of the victims stood together. They had their answers. They had their closure. But they also carried a warning for the rest of the country. The story of Ethan Walker ended with the truth, but it opened a larger question. How many other disappearances have been lost to silence, mistakes, and neglect? That question still echoes today. If you've followed Ethan's story through every part, you've seen how one disappearance exposed failures across the system, from investigation to media, from public trust to personal lives destroyed. These stories matter because they remind us how fragile justice can be and how important it is to keep demanding answers. If you want us to continue uncovering cases like Ethan's, sharing the truth behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story so more people know what happened. Every voice helps keep the memory alive and helps prevent the next tragedy from being ignored.